The neighborhood had always been quiet on the surface, but beneath the manicured lawns and painted fences, tensions ran deep. The HOA board, ruled by a handful of residents who saw themselves as the guardians of suburban perfection, had been on the hunt for new targets lately. Their self-appointed leader, Karen, had turned her gaze toward anything that disrupted her vision of uniformity. No mailbox went unchecked, no shrub untrimmed, and no vehicle sat without scrutiny. It was into this climate that the narrator found himself, living in a modest but tidy house on the corner. His driveway carried a vehicle that didn't quite fit Karen's carefully curated world, a rugged Jeep, built for purpose rather than appearance. It wasn't flashy, nor was it abandoned. It was kept clean, well-maintained, and locked behind a heavy-duty chain when parked. To the average passerby, it was simply a Jeep. But to the task force that relied on it, it was a lifeline. Outfitted with discreet surveillance equipment, modified tires, reinforced suspension, and coded access to special compartments, it was no ordinary civilian ride. Karen, of course, didn't know any of this. To her, the Jeep was an eyesore. She decided it violated some unwritten rule she had constructed in her mind about what belonged in the neighborhood. The official HOA handbook said nothing about utility vehicles, provided they were not abandoned, broken, or commercial. Yet Karen saw in the Jeep something she could turn into her next campaign. The first warning arrived in the form of a neatly folded letter tucked into the front door. It was written in formal language, but carried the sharp edge of accusation. The letter claimed the Jeep was not in keeping with neighborhood standards and demanded its removal within 7 days. For the narrator, it was nothing new. HOAs thrived on intimidation tactics, and Karen wielded these letters like weapons. The paper was filed away, ignored, with the calm confidence of someone who knew both the law and his rights. But Karen was not the kind of person to let dismissal go unchallenged. As the week passed, she grew restless, circling the Jeep whenever she walked her dog, snapping pictures with her phone, and whispering to anyone who would listen. The whispers spread, painting the Jeep as abandoned, unsafe, or worse. Neighbors, some too polite to resist Karen's pressure, began to question why it remained. Others turned a blind eye, knowing the Jeep's owner wasn't careless but quiet. 7 days came and went. The Jeep remained exactly where it was, chained, locked, and untouched. That was when Karen escalated. Another letter appeared, this time more aggressive, citing supposed bylaws and threatening fines. It bore the HOA letterhead but was drafted, in a way that made it clear who had written it. The narrator read it calmly, knowing Karen had no real authority to enforce her threats. Still, the pattern was familiar. She would push, and if she found resistance, she would push harder. What Karen did not realize was that the Jeep's presence was not accidental. The task force had placed it there deliberately, positioning it within easy reach for deployments while keeping it in an environment that blended into suburbia. The narrator, a plainclothes officer assigned to special operations, had been entrusted with its safekeeping. Every lock, every chain, and every bolt on that Jeep was part of maintaining security, not just for him, but for the entire team. As Karen plotted her next move, she unknowingly tread into dangerous territory. Her fixation was no longer about a vehicle that clashed with her ideals. It was about to become a direct interference with a law enforcement operation. The seeds of confrontation had been planted, and by the time Karen cut through the first lock, the quiet suburb would be on the brink of chaos. The Jeep sat under the pale light of the street lamps, its black paint gleaming faintly, as if aware of the storm gathering around it. The narrator, watching from his front window, knew Karen's obsession was growing. He had seen this before, the way small rules became crusades in the hands of people who mistook control for community. What he didn't know was just how far Karen was willing to go. Because while he prepared himself for another letter, another photo, another HOA meeting rant, Karen had already purchased a set of bolt cutters, and she was not planning to wait any longer. The morning began quietly, as many did in the cul-de-sac. Sunlight stretched lazily across trimmed lawns, sprinklers hissed their rhythm, and children's bicycles leaned against picket fences. The kind of suburban stillness that hid the cracks in its own foundation. Yet behind that stillness, a storm had already started brewing. Karen emerged from her house just after dawn, clutching a thermos of coffee in one hand and gripping a pair of oversized bolt cutters in the other. Her gait was purposeful, determined, fueled by the righteous indignation she carried like armor. She believed herself the last defender of order in the neighborhood, the one who had to enforce standards when others were too complacent. To her, the Jeep was a symbol of rebellion. If the HOA's letters had no effect, then force would. Her eyes darted left and right as she crossed the street. Curtains twitched as neighbors noticed, though none dared step outside. Karen's reputation preceded her. Once she was locked into a crusade, few had the will to stop her. She reached the Jeep, the steel chain glinting in the light, and for a brief moment she hesitated. But hesitation was not her nature. The bolt cutters rose, positioned against the heavy lock, and with a grunt, she brought her weight down. The metallic crack split the air, louder than the morning's birdsong, and the lock gave way. The sound echoed across the cul-de-sac. A few neighbors stepped onto porches, whispering to each other, while others recorded from behind windows. Karen straightened, triumph in her eyes, as the lock clattered to the pavement. To her, this was victory, a declaration that no vehicle, no matter how secured, could stand against her interpretation of HOA rules. But the Jeep was no ordinary target. As the chain fell away, it was as if an invisible boundary had been crossed. What Karen saw as a simple neighborhood nuisance was in fact a piece of highly sensitive property. Its contents, hidden compartments, and modifications were meant for trained officers, not meddling suburban enforcers. Karen tugged on the Jeep's handle, but the doors remained locked. She circled it, pulling at different latches, peering through tinted windows. Frustration etched into her face as she realized the lock was only the first of many barriers. Still, she wasn't deterred. She snapped pictures, no doubt planning to present them later as evidence of her intervention, proof that she had done what the HOA board wouldn't. Meanwhile, the narrator watched everything unfold from behind his curtain. His stomach knotted, not with fear, but with the dawning recognition of how far Karen had gone. Cutting a personal lock was one matter. Interfering with property tied to federal operations was something else entirely. He reached for his phone, already anticipating the chain of calls that would follow. The neighborhood murmurs grew louder. Some residents whispered their disapproval, recognizing Karen had overstepped. Others, emboldened by her brazenness, muttered support, convincing themselves that her defiance of the Jeep was somehow in service to community standards. But none of them understood what truly rested beneath the surface. When Karen finally stormed back across the street, dragging the broken chain like a trophy, she believed she had delivered a blow to disorder. In reality, she had triggered the first domino in a line of consequences she could not imagine. Later that evening, the narrator walked to the Jeep. He knelt, inspecting the broken lock. The chain lay loose, a grim reminder of the day's violation. He replaced it with a spare, double-checking the reinforced padlock, and quietly noted the security breach in his official log. Each detail mattered. Each act had to be accounted for. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a security incident. Unbeknownst to Karen, the Jeep carried a hidden tracker and camera system, standard for any task force vehicle left in unsecured locations. The system had already flagged the tampering, quietly transmitting data to headquarters. Within hours, officers in unmarked cars began circling the neighborhood, their presence discreet but deliberate. They weren't there to make a scene. They were there to observe, to assess whether Karen's actions were isolated or the beginning of something more serious. Karen, of course, basked in her imagined victory. She bragged at the HOA meeting that evening, waving her phone filled with pictures, insisting that the Jeep was abandoned, dangerous, or even connected to suspicious activity. Her voice carried its usual self-righteous pitch, and though some nodded along, others shifted uncomfortably, realizing she was no longer simply enforcing rules. She was escalating them into personal crusades. The narrator attended quietly, watching from the back, his expression unreadable. He let her rant, let her dig deeper into her own narrative, knowing that every word spoken in public was another piece of evidence. He didn't need to confront her. The truth had a way of surfacing, especially when someone believed themselves untouchable. By the time the meeting ended, the neighborhood was divided. Half whispered that Karen was a hero, unafraid to take bold action. The other half murmured that she had gone too far. cutting locks and trespassing into matters she didn't understand. What none of them realized was that Karen's action had already drawn the attention of people far beyond the HOA board. Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was classified equipment, and tampering with it carried serious consequences. Law enforcement had been patient, letting the situation play out, but patience was never infinite. Karen slept that night satisfied, convinced she had won another battle for the standards she cherished. But while she dreamed of HOA accolades and neighborly applause, black SUVs idled quietly on the edge of the subdivision. The task force was watching, recording, waiting. The chain had been cut, but it was Karen who had severed the line between petty neighborhood politics and federal jurisdiction. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The days that followed the broken lock were thick with tension. The Jeep sat in its place, secured once again, its silent presence now more menacing than before. Neighbors passed it with uneasy glances, whispers traveling from one porch to another. Some avoided looking at it altogether, as if by ignoring the Jeep, they could also ignore the storm Karen had conjured around it. Karen, however, thrived on the attention. To her, the lock-cutting had been a triumph of willpower. The murmurs, the nervous glances, the quiet disapproval, they all fed her conviction that she alone was standing up for the community. She believed the Jeep's continued presence was proof that the HOA had lost control, and that she was the one bold enough to restore order. At the next HOA board meeting, Karen came prepared. She arrived early, her stack of photographs neatly organized in a folder, her speech rehearsed to the last syllable. When the meeting began, she wasted no time. She rose to her feet, brandishing the images of the broken lock and chain, as though they were evidence in a courtroom trial. Her voice cut through the air, insisting that the Jeep was not only unsightly, but a potential danger to the entire neighborhood. She spoke of abandoned vehicles, criminal associations, and declining property values. Each phrase was carefully chosen to stir fear, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who might otherwise dismiss her crusade. She demanded that the board take immediate action, tow the Jeep, fine its owner, and, if necessary, ban such vehicles from the community altogether. The board, caught between Karen's relentless pressure and their own desire to avoid confrontation, wavered. Some nodded along, not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to openly oppose her, but equally unwilling to endorse her aggression. In the end, the board issued a vague statement. The Jeep would be investigated further, and the matter would be reviewed. To Karen, it was a victory. She left the meeting energized, already envisioning the Jeep hauled away by a tow truck, her name whispered with admiration by grateful neighbors. She didn't see the unease in the room, the way some residents avoided her gaze, or the way others slipped out quietly to distance themselves from her escalating crusade. Meanwhile, the narrator observed from the sidelines. He said little, as always, but every detail was noted. The photos Karen displayed, the words she chose, the reactions of the board. He knew that HOA politics had their own weight, but this was no longer a simple matter of bylaws. Karen had tampered with property that didn't belong to her, and now she was dragging others into the consequences of her actions. Behind the scenes, the task force had already taken interest. The tampering alert from the Jeep's hidden systems had triggered an internal review. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras was pulled, matching Karen's movements with the exact time of the cut lock. Agents discussed her name around conference tables, not as a neighborly nuisance, but as a civilian who had interfered with protected equipment. For the moment, they held back. Their orders were clear: observe, document, and allow the situation to reveal itself. Intervening too soon risked exposing operations better left unseen. But with each passing day, Karen dug herself deeper. Her next move was bold, even reckless. Convinced the board was moving too slowly, she rallied a group of neighbors to her cause. She framed it as a grassroots movement, a collective effort to restore standards. She distributed flyers, posted on community message boards, and whispered into sympathetic ears. Soon, a small but vocal group stood behind her, repeating her claims that the Jeep was a threat. They began staging their own forms of protest, parking cars deliberately close to the Jeep, blocking it from view, or standing nearby to glare at anyone who came too close. Karen treated it like a campaign rally, her followers like devoted constituents. The Jeep, chained and silent, became the centerpiece of a neighborhood standoff. But the narrator noticed what others did not. Each time someone approached the Jeep, too closely, a quiet click issued from its frame as the hidden sensors marked their presence. Each time a flyer was taped to its window, a small camera recorded the hand that placed it there. The Jeep was not defenseless. It was gathering its own evidence, piece by piece, documenting every act of interference. At night, the neighborhood changed. Where once the cul-de-sac had been calm, it now simmered with tension. Groups lingered under streetlights, muttering about the Jeep. SUVs rolled slowly past, their tinted windows hiding the eyes inside. Karen mistook the silence for compliance, the SUVs for curious onlookers. She didn't realize that her actions had drawn the attention of forces she could not control. The breaking point came when Karen announced her plan to escalate yet again. If the board would not act, she declared, she would arrange for a tow truck, herself. She had contacts, she claimed, people who owed her favors. She would see the Jeep removed, lock or no lock, owner's consent or not. To her, it was the logical next step. To anyone else, it was trespassing elevated to theft. The narrator prepared quietly. He reviewed his reports, cross-checked the Jeep's security footage, and forwarded everything to the task force office. He knew that the line had been crossed long ago, but Karen's threat to tow the vehicle marked a new threshold. This was no longer HOA harassment. It was criminal interference. As the week closed, the cul-de-sac hummed with anticipation. Karen's supporters whispered of her plan, eager to see the Jeep gone at last. Her detractors shook their heads, muttering that she was going too far, but few dared to challenge her openly. The board remained silent, paralyzed by indecision. The Jeep waited, its steel frame gleaming under the streetlight, a sentinel in the night. The narrator watched from his window, knowing the next move was inevitable. Karen had set her sights on removing what she could not control. What she did not realize was that the Jeep was not waiting for her. It was waiting for the task force, and the task force was already on its way. The morning of Karen's grand plan dawned heavy with anticipation. The sky was overcast, the air thick and still, as though even nature sensed the confrontation to come. For days, whispers had circulated through the cul-de-sac, passed along like contraband. Some neighbors leaned into the gossip with excitement, others with dread, but all knew that Karen was preparing to take her campaign against the Jeep to its next level. The Jeep itself remained motionless, parked as always in the narrator's driveway, secured with its new chain and heavy-duty lock. Its presence had become more than just a vehicle. It was now a symbol, dividing the community into factions. To Karen and her followers, it was an affront to the neighborhood's image, a threat to property values, and a sign of defiance. To others, it was merely a car, unfairly targeted by an overzealous neighbor who thrived on conflict. Karen spent the morning pacing her driveway, phone pressed tightly to her ear, confirming details with the tow company she had arranged. She had not told them the full story, of course. She framed the Jeep as abandoned, possibly stolen, and assured them she had authority from the HOA to order its removal. The operator, likely used to similar neighborhood disputes, asked few questions. A tow was scheduled for the afternoon. The narrator, however, already knew. The Jeep's security system had flagged unusual calls and logged Karen's movements as she circled the vehicle with her phone, taking fresh photographs. The information had been forwarded automatically to the task force. By the time Karen finalized her plan, the team had already been briefed. They would not allow her to interfere again, not this time. Neighbors emerged from their houses as the afternoon wore on, drawn by the electricity of rumor. Lawn chairs appeared on porches. Conversations hushed as children were called inside. It was as though the entire cul-de-sac was preparing for a show, one they didn't dare interrupt, but couldn't resist watching. Then the tow truck arrived. Its engine rumbled into the neighborhood, loud and unmistakable, drawing eyes from every window. The massive flatbed rolled slowly down the street, guided by Karen's frantic waves. She wore a look of triumph, the kind of expression reserved for someone who believed the battle was already won. The truck pulled up beside the Jeep. The driver, a stocky man in grease-stained coveralls, stepped out and gave Karen a nod. He approached the Jeep, sizing up the situation. The lock and chain were an inconvenience, but hardly an obstacle for someone used to repossessions. He fetched his tools from the back, preparing to snap the chain and drag the vehicle onto his flatbed. But before the driver could make his first move, another vehicle turned into the cul-de-sac. Then another. And another. Black SUVs, windows, tinted, moving with deliberate coordination, pulling up to block both ends of the street. Their engines idled low, heavy, a sound that carried authority. The tow driver froze, tools in hand, as the SUV's doors opened in near-perfect unison. Men and women in plain clothes stepped out, their movements calm but purposeful. They did not shout. They did not rush. They simply walked toward the Jeep with a quiet certainty that changed the air itself. The neighborhood went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Karen's triumphant smile faltered. She looked around, confusion etched on her face, searching for support among the neighbors who had gathered to watch. But no one stepped forward. The weight of the SUVs, the presence of the agents was undeniable. This was no longer a matter of HOA disputes. The tow driver cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he was out of his depth. He muttered something about a mistake and began packing his tools, retreating to the safety of his truck. Karen, however, was not so quick to back down. She marched toward the agents, waving her phone, insisting that the Jeep was a violation, that she had authority, that she was within her rights. The agents barely acknowledged her. They inspected the Jeep with trained eyes, checked the new lock, and exchanged subtle signals. One of them carried a small device, scanning the vehicle, confirming its identity. The tow truck was waved away, dismissed without a word of explanation. The narrator stood at the edge of his driveway, silent, watching the scene unfold. He knew this was the moment Karen had been walking toward all along, blind to the consequences. She had crossed a line she did not understand, and now she was face to face with those who did. Karen continued her tirade, her voice rising as frustration overtook confidence. She demanded answers, demanded compliance, demanded recognition of her supposed authority. But her words carried no weight here. The agents neither argued nor explained. They did not need to. Their presence alone was answer enough. One agent finally turned to her, calm and measured. He spoke only a few words, but they were enough to silence her. Her face paled, the realization dawning slowly that this was not a matter of neighborhood aesthetics, not something she could bend to her will through intimidation or persistence. This was federal. The SUVs lingered only long enough to confirm the Jeep's integrity, document the attempted tow, and ensure its security. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, they left. Engines rumbled, doors shut, and the cul-de-sac returned to silence. The only sound left was the faint squeal of the tow truck's brakes as it hurried away, eager to escape the weight of what it had stumbled into. Karen stood frozen in her driveway, her phone hanging loosely at her side. The neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-closed blinds, their faces lit by the glow of realization. No one said a word. No one offered Karen sympathy or applause. The tide had turned. The Jeep remained where it had always been, silent and immovable, but its presence had shifted. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a boundary, a warning, a reminder that some battles were never meant to be fought. Karen retreated into her house, the slam of her door echoing through the quiet street. For the first time, she looked less like a crusader and more like someone who had finally grasped the size of the force she had provoked. But while she had been silenced for the moment, her story was far from over. Because Karen was not the kind of person to admit defeat easily. And the task force was not the kind of organization to overlook repeated interference. The next chapter of the conflict would no longer be about HOA bylaws or property values. It would be about consequences. The cul-de-sac lingered in silence for days after the tow truck standoff. Conversations were hushed, eyes lingered too long, and doors closed quickly when Karen appeared outside. The black SUVs had vanished as quickly as they'd come, but their presence remained in memory, heavy and unspoken. Neighbors who once nodded politely in Karen's direction now avoided her gaze, unwilling to engage in her crusade after witnessing the authority that had stepped in. But Karen could not let it go. To her, what had happened was not a warning. It was proof. Proof that something about the Jeep was wrong, that its presence was suspicious, that forces larger than the HOA were at play. The thought burrowed into her mind, and rather than discouraging her, It fueled her obsession. She began to spin the story for herself in late-night whispers on the phone and long rants typed into neighborhood forums. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, she claimed. It was evidence of something hidden, perhaps criminal. Why else would black SUVs arrive so suddenly? Why else would the driver be chased off without explanation? Why else would the supposed owner, the quiet man at the corner house, remain so calm in the face of her accusations? In her mind, she was no longer a mere HOA enforcer. She was a truth seeker, exposing secrets buried in plain sight. The Jeep was her key to unmasking a conspiracy, and she was convinced that only she had the courage to pursue it. Karen began watching the house at odd hours. From her front window, she logged the narrator's comings and goings, scribbling notes in a spiral-bound notebook. She recorded videos of the Jeep on her phone, panning slowly across its frame as though capturing evidence for an unseen jury. At night, she whispered into the camera, narrating her suspicions, promising her followers on private social media groups that she would not rest until she uncovered the truth. Her fixation soon spread into paranoia. Every car that passed slowly down the street became a surveillance vehicle. Every delivery truck was a cover for observation. Every neighbor who didn't share her outrage was a collaborator, or worse, part of the supposed conspiracy. Where others saw ordinary suburbia, Karen saw a battlefield of secrets. Meanwhile, the task force continued its quiet watch. The Jeep's sensors captured her nightly inspections, her phone lights reflecting in the glass, her hands pressed against the windows as she searched for clues. Agents logged her behavior, each incident another line in a growing file. What had begun as an act of nuisance was becoming something more dangerous, a civilian who refused to disengage, pushing herself closer and closer to legal jeopardy. The narrator knew Karen was escalating, but he also knew her downfall would not come from confrontation. It would come from her own refusal to stop. So he let her dig deeper, never responding to her glares, never reacting to her late-night prowls. He documented everything, forwarding his reports to headquarters, where agents reviewed them with a mixture of concern and anticipation. Karen's determination reached a breaking point when she stumbled upon the idea of hidden compartments. She had read an article online about vehicles used in smuggling, describing secret panels and disguised storage. It was all the confirmation she needed. The Jeep, she decided, wasn't just unsightly. It was a criminal vessel. Drugs, weapons, maybe even surveillance equipment. Her imagination supplied endless possibilities. Fueled by this conviction, Karen plotted a new move. If she couldn't force the HOA to act, if she couldn't compel the tow company to finish the job, then she would gather evidence herself. She convinced two of her staunchest supporters to help, persuading them with stories of neighborhood safety and whispered hints of lawbreaking. Under cover of night, she promised, they would inspect the Jeep directly. A closer look would reveal the truth she was certain lay hidden inside. But what Karen didn't understand was that the Jeep was not just protected by locks and chains. Its systems were designed to detect tampering. Motion sensors, vibration detectors, and hidden cameras were woven into its frame. Anyone who tried to force entry would not only fail, they would trigger alerts that went straight to the task force. On a cool Thursday night, under the dim glow of a half-moon, Karen put her plan into action. Dressed in dark clothing, she and her two companions crept across the street. They carried flashlights, gloves, and a set of tools Karen had borrowed from one of her followers. Their whispers were nervous, but Karen's confidence drove them forward. They approached the Jeep, their shadows long against its steel body. Karen tested the lock with the edge of a tool, pulling at the chain, rattling it softly. One of her accomplices circled to the back, searching for any sign of weakness. The other kept watch, shifting uneasily as the neighborhood slept around them. The Jeep did not resist in silence. Its sensors clicked on, its hidden cameras blinked to life, and within moments, a silent alarm transmitted across encrypted channels. The task force, already attuned to Karen's pattern of behavior, responded swiftly. Black SUVs rolled out again, this time with less subtlety. Their engines broke the night stillness, their headlights flaring across driveways as they pulled into the cul-de-sac. Doors opened, agents stepped out, and the quiet street was flooded with the weight of authority. Karen froze, her tools still wedged against the lock. Her accomplices stumbled backward, fear flashing across their faces. The neighborhood stirred. Awake, lights flicked on, curtains parted, and sleepy eyes widened as the spectacle unfolded. The narrator stepped onto his porch, arms crossed, watching as the agents surrounded the Jeep. This time, there was no ignoring the severity of the situation. Karen had not just cut a lock or filed complaints. She had attempted to break into classified property. The agents moved with precision, recording the scene, collecting the tools, and logging every detail. Karen tried to speak, her words tumbling out in frantic bursts, but no one listened. Her accomplices slipped away, retreating into the shadows of their homes, eager to distance themselves from the disaster. When the agents finally turned to Karen, their verdict was clear. She was no longer just a nuisance or a meddling neighbor. She had crossed into criminal interference. The cul-de-sac, once a stage for her crusade, had become the site of her downfall. And the Jeep, unmoved and unyielding, had done nothing but sit in place, waiting for her obsession to consume her. The neighborhood awoke the next morning to a new reality. The previous night's drama had spread like wildfire through the cul-de-sac, whispered in kitchens, muttered over fences, and relayed through text threads that lit up with disbelief. The sight of Karen, caught red-handed trying to break into the Jeep, surrounded by agents in the middle of the night, had shattered the illusion she had built for years. She was no longer the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. She was no longer the loudest voice at HOA meetings, dictating lawn lengths and mailbox colors. Now, she was the woman under investigation, the one who had taken her obsession too far. The agents had not taken Karen away in handcuffs that night, but the warnings had been firm, their tone unmistakable. She had crossed into dangerous territory, tampering with secured property tied to law enforcement. There would be reports, reviews, and possibly charges. The choice of how far to push the matter was not hers anymore. For the first time, Karen looked small in her own home. She pulled the curtains shut and avoided the sidewalks she once patrolled so proudly. Neighbors who had once tolerated her, even humored her, now crossed the street to avoid her. Some whispered that she had embarrassed them all, dragging the community into scrutiny it had never asked for. Others quietly admitted they had always known she would go too far. The HOA board, once cowed by her bluster, now distanced itself completely. An emergency meeting was called, not by Karen, but by members who had grown weary of her tyranny. The minutes of that meeting were sharp and clear. Karen no longer represented the board, nor would she dictate its agenda. Complaints against her were recorded, and her behavior was formally condemned. Karen's allies dwindled to none. Even those who had once stood by her side during her campaign against the Jeep found excuses to slip away. They cited confusion, misunderstanding, or claimed they had never truly supported her actions. Her flyers disappeared from message boards. Her rants on neighborhood forums were deleted or ignored. She had become the pariah of the very community she had tried to control. Meanwhile, the Jeep remained, as steady and unbothered as it had always been. To most neighbors, it now carried a different aura. It was no longer the object of scorn or suspicion. It was the reminder of a line not to be crossed, a symbol of authority that had humbled even the most relentless meddler. The narrator carried on as always, tending to his home quietly, his demeanor unchanged. But inside, he knew the moment had finally arrived to bring the matter to a close. His superiors had reviewed the reports, the footage, the repeated incidents of interference. Their patience had limits, and Karen had reached them. The letter arrived at Karen's door 1 week later, not from the HOA, but from the legal offices downtown. It was crisp, formal, and unyielding. It outlined the investigation into her actions, cutting a secured lock, attempting to tow protected property, and attempting to break into a classified vehicle. Each line was a reminder that her obsession had not been harmless. Each paragraph carried the weight of potential prosecution. Karen read it in silence. The bravado that had once defined her melted away as she realized the scope of what she faced. There were no neighbors to rally behind her, no HOA board to manipulate, no audience to applaud her defiance. There was only the reality of her actions, laid bare on paper, undeniable and inescapable. The neighborhood, meanwhile, began to heal. Without Karen's constant surveillance and nitpicking, the cul-de-sac felt lighter. Children played more freely, neighbors chatted openly, and the tension that had once hung in the air began to dissolve. People planted flowers, painted fences, and waved at each other without fear of criticism. Life returned, slowly but surely, to normal. One evening, weeks after the incident, the narrator stood in his driveway beside the Jeep. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the quiet street. A neighbor approached hesitantly, offering a nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent gesture, a recognition of what had happened and of the calm that had returned. The Jeep, for all the chaos it had sparked, remained a constant. It was more than just a vehicle. It was a tool of service, a safeguard for operations that most would never know. The narrator understood the weight of that responsibility, and he carried it without complaint. The neighborhood did not need to know the full details. It was enough that order had been restored, both on their street and in the files of the task force. Karen's house sat dark and quiet. She had retreated from the public eye, her energy spent, her crusades silenced. The woman who once marched across lawns with letters and threats now kept to her own four walls, awaiting the outcome of her legal troubles. For the first time, she was forced to live under the rules she had tried so hard to impose on others. The final irony was not lost on the narrator. Karen had believed herself the enforcer, the protector of standards. Yet in her relentless pursuit of control, she had collided with forces far greater than any HOA could muster. She had tried to seize what was never hers, and in doing so, had destroyed the authority she once wielded. The Jeep sat quietly in the driveway, locked and secure. A silent witness to the downfall of a neighbor who had mistaken power for purpose. The cul-de-sac breathed easier. The weight of Karen's reign finally lifted. And though no one spoke of it openly, the lesson lingered in every trimmed lawn and painted fence. Sometimes, the battles worth fighting are not the ones chosen by self-appointed crusaders. Sometimes the strongest statement is silence, patience, and the certainty that those who overstep will eventually stumble on their own. Karen had stumbled. The Jeep remained, and the neighborhood moved on.